Imagine a vast empire stretching across 11 time zones, housing nearly 300 million people and wielding unimaginable power. In 1991, that empire, the Soviet Union, collapsed, leaving behind a shattered legacy and a new nation, Russia, struggling to find its place in the world. But what if the story didn't end there? What if, beneath the surface, a plan has been brewing for decades to reclaim the lost glory, the lost territories, and the lost power? This is a story of how the Soviet Union turned into Russia and the ongoing secretive efforts to restore what was once lost. In the bitter cold of December 1991, the world watched in stunned silence as the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. It was a moment that symbolized the end of an era, the collapse of a superpower that had once stood toe-to-toe with the United States. For millions, it was the end of a nightmare. For others, it was the beginning of a new uncertainty. Amid the chaos and confusion, a quiet determination began to take root in the hearts of many Russians. A determination to bring back the lost empire, brick by brick. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, officially established in 1922, was more than just a country. It was a colossal experiment in ideology, governance, and global influence. Under the leadership of Lenin and later Stalin, the USSR became a global superpower, spreading communism across Eastern Europe, Asia, and beyond. However, this rapid expansion and the relentless pursuit of ideological purity came at a cost. By the 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet system were becoming impossible to ignore. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and the heavy burden of maintaining a vast military-industrial complex were dragging the country down. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he introduced reforms, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, to revitalize the Soviet Union. But instead of saving the empire, these reforms unleashed a wave of pent-up frustrations. The Soviet republics, each with its own distinct identity, began to assert their independence. Nationalist movements gained momentum, and by the end of 1991, the once unbreakable Union had disintegrated. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, were the first to break away, followed by the other republics. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union was officially dissolved the next day. For many in Russia, the collapse was a devastating blow. Overnight, they had lost their status as citizens of a superpower, and the country was plunged into a deep economic and social crisis. The 1990s were a period of immense hardship, with hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and a sense of national humiliation. Russia was no longer the center of a vast empire. It was a struggling nation trying to find its footing in a new world order. The rise of Vladimir Putin and the new Russian identity. In 1999, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was appointed as the Prime Minister of Russia. Few could have predicted the impact this relatively unknown figure would have on the future of Russia and the world. Putin quickly rose to power, becoming president in 2000, and began to consolidate his authority, taking control of the media, the economy, and the political system. Under Putin, Russia experienced a period of relative stability and economic growth, fueled by high oil prices and a renewed sense of national pride. However, this stability came at a price. Political dissent was crushed, opposition leaders were silenced or exiled, and the state increasingly controlled every aspect of Russian life. But Putin's vision for Russia was not just about restoring order and growth. It was about reclaiming the glory of the Soviet era. He began to reshape the narrative of Russia's history, portraying the collapse of the Soviet Union as a tragic mistake, a geopolitical catastrophe, as he famously called it. In Putin's view, Russia had been humiliated and weakened by the West, and it was his mission to restore the country's power and influence. One of the key elements of Putin's strategy has been to revive the Soviet-era symbolism and rhetoric. The Soviet anthem was reintroduced as the national anthem of Russia. Soviet-style military parades returned to Red Square, and the achievements of the Soviet Union particularly its victory in World War II, were glorified. This revival of Soviet nostalgia has been a powerful tool in shaping a new Russian identity, one that is proud of its history and determined to reclaim its place as a global power. Putin's ambitions have not been limited to rhetoric and symbolism. Over the years, Russia has taken concrete steps to reassert its influence in the former Soviet republics. The 2008 war with Georgia, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine are all part of a broader strategy to bring the near abroad back under Moscow's control. The annexation of Crimea was particularly significant. It marked the first time since World War II that a European nation had forcibly annexed territory from another country. This move was widely condemned by the international community, but it was celebrated in Russia. For many Russians, Crimea represented a return to the country's rightful place in history, a reclaiming of what had been unjustly taken away. This move solidified Putin's popularity at home, even as it led to widespread sanctions and international isolation. But Putin's ambitions extend beyond territorial expansion. He has sought to establish Russia as a counterweight to the West, particularly the United States and NATO. This has involved deepening ties with countries like China, Iran, and Syria, and positioning Russia as a defender of traditional values against what he portrays as the moral decay of the West. This narrative has resonated with many Russians, particularly older generations who remember the Soviet Union's role as a global superpower. Yet, despite these challenges, Putin's grip on power remains strong. He has cultivated an image of himself as the savior of Russia, the leader who will restore the country's greatness and protect it from external threats. This image has been bolstered by a carefully controlled media environment and the suppression of political opposition. As a result, Putin enjoys broad support among the Russian population, particularly among those who long for a return to the stability and power of the Soviet era. The plan to reclaim the lost empire. The collapse of the Soviet Union left Russia with a profound sense of loss, not just of territory, but of identity and purpose. For Putin and many in his inner circle, the dissolution of the USSR was an act of betrayal, and they have been quietly working to reverse it ever since. This plan to reclaim the lost empire is not about recreating the Soviet Union in its exact form. Instead, it's about restoring Russia's influence over its former territories, rebuilding a sphere of influence that would make Russia the dominant power in Eurasia once again. One of the key strategies has been the use of frozen conflicts in the former Soviet republics. By supporting separatist movements and pro-Russian factions in places like Moldova, Transnistria, Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia has created a series of buffer zones that serve to destabilize these countries and keep them within Moscow's orbit. In Ukraine, the situation is particularly complex. The 2014 annexation of Crimea was followed by the outbreak of conflict in eastern Ukraine, where Russian-backed separatists declared independence from Kyiv. The war in Donbass has been a protracted and bloody conflict, with thousands of lives lost and no clear resolution in sight. For Russia, this conflict serves multiple purposes. It prevents Ukraine from fully integrating with the West, it destabilizes a key neighbor, and it demonstrates Russia's willingness to use force to protect its interests. Another important element of this plan has been the creation of the Eurasian Economic Union, the EAEU, a regional economic bloc that includes Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. The EAEU is often seen as an attempt to recreate the economic ties of the Soviet Union, providing Russia with a mechanism to exert control over its neighbors through trade and economic integration. The support for this agenda within Russia is bolstered by a combination of propaganda, nationalism, and a deep-seated belief in the country's historical destiny. State-controlled media portray Putin as a strong leader, defending Russia from a hostile West, while schools teach a version of history that emphasizes the greatness of the Soviet Union and the injustices of its collapse. For many Russians, particularly the older generations, the idea of reclaiming the lost empire resonates deeply. The memories of Soviet power and influence, combined with the hardships of the post-Soviet period, have created a longing for a return to greatness. This sentiment is skillfully exploited by the Kremlin to maintain public support for its actions. But the question remains, can Russia truly restore its lost empire? The world has changed dramatically since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the geopolitical landscape is far more complex. While Russia has achieved some successes, such as the annexation of Crimea and its influence in Syria, it faces significant challenges both at home and abroad. Economic stagnation, demographic decline, and growing international isolation are just a few of the hurdles that Putin must overcome if he is to achieve his vision. Personalized thoughts. The transformation from the Soviet Union to modern-day Russia is a tale of both loss and resilience. As I reflect on this journey, I am struck by the sheer complexity of the emotions tied to it. The collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just the end of a political entity. It was the end of an entire way of life for millions. For some, it meant newfound freedom and hope for a democratic future. For others, it was a period of deep disillusionment, a fall from greatness that left a void difficult to fill. I can't help but wonder about the deep longing many Russians feel for the past, a past that, while filled with hardships, also gave them a sense of pride and belonging on the global stage. This nostalgia, I believe, is what fuels the current Russian leadership's desire to reclaim lost influence. But I also ponder the cost of this ambition. The aggressive moves to restore Russia's sphere of influence, such as the annexation of Crimea and the involvement in conflicts, raises important ethical questions. Is the pursuit of past glory worth the price of international isolation and international strife? Personally, I see a country grappling with its identity, torn between the shadows of its past and the possibilities of its future. Russia stands at a crossroads, and the path it chooses will have profound implications not just for its people, but for the world. My hope is that this path leads to a future where Russia finds strength in unity, cooperation, and peace, rather than in the echoes of an empire that no longer exists. History is not destiny, and perhaps in this reflection lies a chance for a different, more hopeful narrative to emerge. As we look at the unfolding events in Russia and its former territories, it's clear that the story of the Soviet Union's collapse is far from over. The echoes of that seismic event still reverberate through the corridors of power in Moscow, where a new generation of leaders is determined to reclaim what was lost. The plan to restore Russia's influence over its neighbors, to rebuild its sphere of influence, and to challenge the Western-dominated world order is ambitious and fraught with risk. It has already led to conflicts, economic hardships, and a deepening rift between Russia and the West. But for Putin and many Russians, these are necessary sacrifices on the path to restoring their nation's greatness. The world watches with bated breath, wondering what the future holds for Russia and its neighbors. Will Putin succeed in his quest to rebuild the lost empire? Or will his ambitions ultimately lead to Russia's further isolation and decline? The answer to these questions will shape the future of not only Russia, but of the entire world. As we ponder these possibilities, it's important to remember that history is not just about the past. It's about the choices we make in the present and the future we create. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse and Russia's resurgence is a reminder that empires rise and fall, but the desire for power, influence, and identity endures. And in that enduring desire lies the potential for both greatness and tragedy. In the end, the future of Russia and its place in the world will be determined not just by the actions of its leaders, but by the will of its people. Whether they choose to look forward to a new era of cooperation and peace, or backward to a time of conflict and empire, will shape the destiny of Russia for generations to come. And in that choice lies the true power to determine the course of history.